Hollow Creek was the kind of town where the fog hung thick, cloaking the twisted trees and shadowy hillsides. By day, it seemed like any other quaint village, but come nightfall, especially when thunderstorms rolled over the mountains, it transformed into something else entirely. Locals knew to lock their doors, never venture down the winding road after dark, and certainly not stop for strangers. And the reason was simple: a legend whispered for generations, feared but rarely spoken aloud. The story of the phantom hitchhiker had gripped Hollow Creek in a vice of terror. It was said she only appeared during thunderstorms, her figure barely visible through sheets of rain, draped in a soaked white dress with her face hidden beneath a tangled mess of dark hair. Drivers who happened upon her would first see her standing by the side of the road, a silhouette outlined by lightning, raising a pale, trembling hand. Most sped by, the locals at least, for they knew better. But for the occasional visitor or those unheeding the warnings, stopping for her was a mistake, one they wouldn't live to make again. One rainy October night, Jacob Callahan, a young journalist with a nose for mystery, found himself on that desolate road. He had come to Hollow Creek with a camera and notebook, curious about the local legends and the story of the vanishing hitchhiker. For him, it was a thrilling challenge. He had no patience for ghost stories and believed that all mysteries had rational explanations. So, as the storm began to rumble and the sky darkened, he couldn't resist the lure of that infamous road. The rain hammered down, and visibility was next to nothing. Suddenly, Jacob caught a glimpse of a figure standing on the side of the road. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with the thrill of finally encountering what he had come for. He pulled over, rolled down his window, and saw her, dripping wet, looking fragile and lost. Her eyes, hollow and dark, looked through him as if staring into his soul. She didn't say a word, only climbed into the back seat without an invitation, her presence chilling the air by 10 degrees. Jacob felt the weight of her silence pressing down, but he was determined to learn more. He tried to engage her in conversation, asking who she was, where she needed to go, but she only sat in the shadows, her face hidden as she muttered softly under her breath, a strange, haunting lullaby. As he drove on, the rain grew heavier and the road twisted into unfamiliar turns that he didn't remember seeing before. Each glance in the rearview mirror revealed her staring directly into his eyes, her mouth curled in a half-smile that sent shivers down his spine. The farther he drove, the stranger the road became, stretching endlessly into a dark oblivion. He felt trapped, his mind clouded with the haunting melody she continued to sing. Then, without warning, she leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper, and said, "Do you know what happened to me here?" The words clung to the air, and Jacob's pulse raced. In that instant, the car's radio blared to life, static crackling before a voice cut through, an emergency broadcast warning of severe thunderstorms and a request for travelers to stay indoors. "Do you know what happened to me?" she repeated, louder this time. He felt her cold breath on his neck, and a wave of terror surged through him. The road suddenly twisted violently, his headlights illuminating a small, crooked bridge he was certain hadn't been there before. The woman began to laugh, a hollow, echoing sound that reverberated through the car. And then, just as the bridge loomed closer, she screamed. Jacob swerved, his heart racing, barely managing to bring the car to a halt, before skidding dangerously close to the edge. He whipped around, but the back seat was empty. She was gone, vanished without a trace. Only the wet indentations on the seat remained, the faint scent of earth and decay hanging in the air. Trembling, Jacob tried to restart the car, but the engine was dead, refusing to come to life as if frozen by the terror of what had just happened. Desperation clawed at him, and he stumbled out into the storm, his feet sinking into the muddy road. A flash of lightning illuminated the bridge, and there, on the other side, he saw her, watching him with that same eerie smile. Her form wavered, half-transparent, flickering in and out with each lightning strike. Jacob tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat as she began to walk toward him, each step slow and deliberate. Frantically, he stumbled back to the car, but the doors were locked. The windows fogged, and he felt a presence behind him, turning slowly to see her face pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with a hunger that chilled him to the bone. "They never find their way back," she whispered, her voice crackling like the static on the radio. And then, with one final burst of thunder, she was gone. When the storm passed, a local search team found his car abandoned, keys in the ignition, but no trace of Jacob. Only a notebook left in the passenger seat told his story, scrawled in shaky handwriting. The last line read, "She is here in the storm, forever watching." Ashwood was a town of dense woods, curling mists, and stories buried deep in the soil. Just beyond the last row of houses and past an overgrown pathway, the house that whispers stood silent and ominous. Tall and broken, it loomed against the dark sky, the scent of burnt wood lingering long after the fire that had ravaged it years ago. Once, it had been a beautiful, grand Victorian manor that belonged to the Delaney family. A couple, their 3 children, and their elderly grandmother. But the house had been abandoned since the night a fire swept through, taking the family with it, leaving only the charred skeleton of the building behind. And since that tragic night, the house had been haunted by more than memories. At least that's what the townsfolk believed. For years, they'd spoken in hushed voices about the whispers. Anyone who approached the house could hear them, muffled voices, like fragments of conversations echoing through the empty rooms and down the darkened hallways. Most people said it was just the wind, but those who dared to go closer insisted that the whispers sounded like the Delaneys, trapped and reliving their final moments. Mia Brooks had grown up hearing the tales. As a young journalist hungry for a story, she was intrigued by the house and what lay within it. She'd spent her childhood imagining the lives of the Delaney family and how they might have lived before the fire. Now, she was determined to find out the truth. Armed with a flashlight, her voice recorder, and a notebook, Mia decided one chilly October evening to visit the house that whispers. The night was thick with fog, the kind that swallowed the sounds of the town behind her. As she made her way down the narrow, winding path to the house, Mia felt the hairs on her arms prickling. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of her eyes, and the creak of branches sounded like footsteps trailing her. When she finally reached the house, it looked darker and more sinister than she had remembered, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the night. A strange shiver passed through her as she stepped up to the front door, which hung slightly ajar, swaying ever so gently as though it had been waiting for her. Inside, the silence was heavy, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. Her flashlight cast a weak beam, illuminating patches of peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. The faint scent of smoke still lingered, mingling with the thick, musty odor of decay. The walls bore the scars of fire, blackened streaks that seemed to twist and curl, almost as if painted by the flames themselves. She began to move through the house, taking notes as she went, describing each room, the unsettling atmosphere, the strange, suffocating stillness. And then she heard it, a faint whisper drifting through the silence. It was so soft at first that she thought it might be her imagination, or perhaps the wind slipping through the broken windows. But as she continued through the house, the whispers grew louder. She stopped, straining to hear. They were voices, fragmented, overlapping, barely audible. A woman's soft voice, almost like a lullaby, intermingled with the faint laughter of children and the hushed murmurs of an elderly man. Her heart pounded as she fumbled for her voice recorder, switching it on and holding it out in the air. The whispers filled the room around her, growing louder, as though the house were alive and breathing. She heard words now, broken phrases, names she couldn't quite make out. She followed the sounds down a long hallway, feeling a strange pull, as if the voices were leading her somewhere. At the end of the hallway was a grand, scorched staircase that curved up to the second floor. With each step, the whispers grew louder, filling her ears until they seemed to echo inside her head. At the top of the stairs, she stopped, casting her flashlight over the dark, empty rooms. Shadows clung to the corners, shifting and curling as her light passed over them. She called out, her voice trembling, "Is anyone here?" Silence, and then a child's laugh, light and haunting, drifting through the shadows. Her flashlight flickered, and a chill passed over her. She glanced down the hallway and saw, for just an instant, the faint outline of a young girl standing in a doorway. Mia's heart skipped, her hand tightening around the flashlight. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. She forced herself to keep going, curiosity and dread mingling as she moved deeper into the house. The voices grew louder, filling her ears with their soft, pleading tones. It was almost as if they were trying to tell her something, to show her something that had been lost. She walked past a shattered mirror, its glass reflecting the fractured shadows, and into what must have once been a bedroom. The wallpaper here was scorched and peeling, and an old burnt crib lay in one corner. The sight sent a shiver down her spine, and she could almost imagine the fire licking at the walls, the smoke filling the air as the family tried to escape. Suddenly, the voices turned urgent. She could hear a woman crying, her voice thick with fear, calling out names that Mia couldn't quite make out. A man's voice followed, sharp and pleading, filled with an anguish that made her heart ache. She felt the weight of their terror, as if it were pressing down on her, squeezing the air from her lungs. And then, in the darkness, she felt a chill, an icy hand, as soft as silk, brushing against her arm. She froze, every nerve in her body screaming. She glanced down, her heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness and the faint whisper of a child's voice saying, "Help us." A wave of dread washed over her as she stumbled backward, her mind racing. She could feel the house around her, watching, waiting. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy, and the whispers grew louder, filling her ears with cries of fear and pain. She turned, running down the hallway, her flashlight flickering as she stumbled down the stairs. The voices followed her, echoing through the house, desperate, pleading, as if begging her to stay, to hear their story. But she couldn't stay. The house was alive, filled with the memories of those who had perished, trapped in an endless loop of suffering. She burst through the front door and into the cold night, the voices fading behind her as she stumbled down the path, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She glanced back once, seeing the dark silhouette of the house against the night sky, its windows gleaming like empty eyes. For days afterward, Mia couldn't shake the experience. She listened to the recording, hoping to hear the voices again, but all she could make out was a faint, crackling static. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through the trees, she thought she could hear them, the whispers of the Delaney family, forever trapped in the house that had claimed them, calling out for help that would never come. The townsfolk never heard from Mia again. Some said she had left town, unable to face the memories of that night. Others believed she'd gone mad, haunted by the voices she'd heard in the house. But a few whispered that she had returned to the house one last time, drawn back by the voices that had called to her, and that she too had become one of the lost souls, forever whispering in the darkened halls of the house that whispers. In the small town of Willowbrook, the old bridge stood like a sentinel over Black River, its worn stones weathered by centuries and steeped in local legends. Built long before modern roads cut through the landscape, the bridge connected Willowbrook to the rest of the world. By day, it was a simple, if eerie, landmark, a place where kids dared each other to go late at night. But after sundown, especially around midnight, no one dared to cross the old bridge. Stories whispered that a shadowy figure lingered there, waiting beneath the bridge's arch, beckoning the unsuspecting to venture closer. Those who were brave or foolish enough to investigate rarely returned unchanged. It was a moonless night in mid-October when Samuel Reeves found himself on the narrow road that led to the bridge. He'd been on a long drive back from his sister's, the route familiar yet unnervingly dark, swallowed by an endless stretch of woods on both sides. His car's headlights cut through the gloom, casting an eerie glow over the old stone as he approached the bridge. Samuel had grown up with tales of the old bridge's ghostly figure, the stories brushed off as harmless folklore, until now. As he drew closer, a chill seeped into the car, and he felt an inexplicable pull, a dark urge to stop. A figure stood near the base of the bridge, just barely visible in the dim light, a shadow draped in what looked like a long coat. Samuel's heart skipped a beat, but he reminded himself it was just an illusion, maybe a trick of the light. Yet something compelled him to slow down, to get a better look. The figure seemed to move, shifting under the bridge's arch, fading in and out of view, as if wrapped in the shadows themselves. Samuel felt his curiosity get the better of him. He pulled over to the side of the road, grabbing his flashlight and stepping into the cold night. The air was thick with silence, the only sounds his footsteps crunching on the gravel. His breath hung in misty puffs as he made his way toward the bridge. He called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" His voice echoed, swallowed up by the oppressive darkness. The figure was gone, but as he stepped beneath the bridge, his flashlight flickering in his hand, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a bone-deep fear he couldn't shake. He moved the beam of light slowly across the stone walls, the shadows dancing with each shift. And then he saw it, a faint, dark stain on the stone, something that looked suspiciously like blood. It was old, faded, but unmistakable. Samuel's mind raced, recalling the rumors that circulated in the town. Decades ago, there had been a toll keeper at the bridge, a man who, in a fit of madness, had reportedly taken the lives of passing travelers, casting them into the river below. No one knew what had happened to him, but it was said that his spirit lingered, forever bound to the bridge, searching for new victims to join him. Just as he was about to turn back to the car, Samuel heard a low, guttural whisper, like the scrape of metal against stone. He froze, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The whisper grew louder, surrounding him, filling the dark space beneath the bridge. He tried to move, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. Cold, clammy fingers seemed to brush the back of his neck, sending a shiver down his spine. He turned sharply, swinging the flashlight behind him, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness, thick and all-consuming. Then he saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring at him from the shadows, gleaming with a sinister hunger. His breath caught as the figure began to emerge slowly, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. The tollkeeper, dressed in tattered clothes, his face pale and hollow, lips stretched in a twisted smile. Samuel stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. The tollkeeper moved closer, his footsteps echoing against the stone, his hand outstretched as if beckoning Samuel closer. Desperate, Samuel scrambled to pick up the flashlight, but the light had gone out. He was plunged into darkness, his vision blurring as the figure loomed over him. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around his mind, twisting his thoughts. Visions began to flood his senses, faces he didn't recognize, twisted in terror, their screams piercing the air. He could see them, countless souls trapped beneath the bridge, reaching out to him with skeletal hands, their eyes empty and pleading. Samuel staggered, his head spinning, as he tried to find his way back to the road. But every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into the darkness, the tollkeeper's whispers echoing in his mind. He could feel the presence behind him, closer with each second, the figure's icy breath on the back of his neck. Shadows stretched and writhed around him, like black tendrils pulling him back toward the bridge. And then he heard the tollkeeper's voice, clear and sharp in his ear. "You crossed the bridge and now you must pay the toll." The voice sent a chill through his body, freezing him in place. Samuel struggled to resist, to escape, but the visions filled his mind, twisting his reality. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, pulling him down, the earth swallowing him inch by inch. Somehow he managed to break free, stumbling back onto the road. The sky was lightening, the first hints of dawn breaking through the trees. The whispers faded, the darkness lifting, but the tollkeeper's voice still echoed in his mind. Samuel didn't look back. He ran to his car, his hands shaking as he started the engine, desperate to escape the horrors that lurked beneath the bridge. As he drove away, he caught one last glimpse of the bridge in his rearview mirror. There, standing in the shadows, was the tollkeeper, watching him, waiting for his next victim. And as Samuel fled, he knew he would never be free of the visions, the faces, the twisted, haunted souls, forever trapped beneath the old bridge. In the secluded Valley of Birchwood, there had once been a lively village, a place where families had settled long ago, cultivating the land and building homes nestled among the tall trees. Every autumn, the townspeople held a grand festival, the Harvest Feast, to honor the families who had founded Birchwood and to give thanks for the bounties of the land. Tables were spread across the village green, laden with fruits, bread, and roasted meats, while lanterns hung from trees, casting a warm glow across the festivities. People danced, children played, and the air was filled with laughter. But one year, something went terribly wrong. It was on the eve of the harvest feast, when Birchwood simply vanished. No one from the neighboring towns saw or heard from the village again. A week after the festival should have ended, locals who came to trade found only an empty clearing where Birchwood had once stood. The houses, the market, the towering oaks that had lined the village green, all were gone, as if they had been swallowed by the earth. The only sign that anyone had ever lived there was a faint, lingering smell of wood smoke, and the disturbing silence that filled the hollow where the village had once been. Rumors spread like wildfire, and soon Birchwood became a legend, a tale parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far into the woods. The land where the village had stood became cursed in the minds of locals, a place haunted by the souls of those who had disappeared that fateful night. And though years passed, some claimed to see strange lights floating among the trees, especially during the time of the harvest feast. People spoke of glowing lanterns flickering in the forest, as if the villagers were still celebrating, lost in a perpetual festival that no one from the outside could reach. Decades later, this mystery drew the attention of Grace Sinclair, a historian and folklorist who was fascinated by the darker stories hidden in remote towns. Determined to uncover the truth of Birchwood, Grace set out on her own expedition, bringing only a notebook, a flashlight, and a camera. It was late autumn, and as she traveled toward the place where Birchwood had once stood, the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting shadows that danced like specters on the ground. When she finally reached the clearing, Grace felt an eerie stillness settle over her, as though she had stepped into a forgotten corner of the world. The clearing was vast and empty, save for a ring of ancient stones that marked where the village's outer edge had been. Grace walked carefully, noting that the earth felt softer here, like a carpet of moss covering something long buried. The light was fading quickly, and just as she decided to set up her camp for the night, she noticed a faint glow flickering among the trees in the distance. At first, she thought it was just fireflies, but the lights moved in a slow, rhythmic pattern, floating in clusters and casting an unnatural glow. Intrigued, Grace followed the lights, her heart pounding as they led her deeper into the forest. She felt as if she were in a trance, each step pulling her further from the safety of the clearing. The lights flickered ahead, weaving through the trees like ghostly lanterns. She walked for what felt like hours, the sounds of the forest fading until only the whisper of the wind remained. And then she saw it, the village of Birchwood, restored as if it had never been gone. The houses stood in neat rows, their windows glowing warmly, and the village green was alive with the sights and sounds of a grand festival. But something was wrong. The air was thick and cold, and the villagers moved with an unsettling grace, their faces pale, their eyes glazed as if they were not truly alive. Grace stood frozen, her mind racing as she realized that these were the villagers who had disappeared. They were trapped here, bound to the festival that had claimed them, and they didn't seem to notice her at all. She watched as they moved around her, laughing and chatting, their voices strangely hollow, their movements looping in a way that was both mesmerizing and horrifying. Desperate to understand what she was witnessing, Grace approached one of the villagers, a young woman with long dark hair. "Excuse me, what is this place?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman turned, her eyes meeting Grace's, and for a brief moment her expression shifted, a flicker of awareness breaking through. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. We are cursed, bound to the feast forever." Before Grace could respond, the woman turned away, fading back into the crowd, her face once again blank and serene. The lights around her grew brighter, and the villagers began to dance, their movements frantic, almost desperate, as if they were caught in a ritual they couldn't control. Grace felt the ground beneath her tremble, a low, rumbling hum filling the air. It was then she noticed the stone altar at the center of the village green, an object that had not been part of any record of Birchwood. On its surface were markings, symbols she didn't recognize, and as she stared, they seemed to pulse, drawing her closer. Her heart pounded as she approached the altar, feeling an overwhelming compulsion to reach out and touch it. But as her hand hovered over the cold stone, a voice echoed through the clearing, a deep, resonant sound that chilled her to the core. "The feast demands a toll," it said, each word filled with a dark, ancient power. "Only those who honor the pact may pass through these woods. All others must join the feast." The villagers stopped their dance, turning to face her, their empty eyes fixed on her with a strange intensity. Grace's pulse quickened, and she stumbled back, realizing with horror that they were closing in, their faces contorted in expressions of sorrow and despair. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the ground as the lights chased her, illuminating the twisted trees and casting grotesque shadows that seemed to reach out to pull her back. Branches clawed at her, the whispers of the villagers filling her ears, pleading for her to stay, to join them. She could feel their cold breath on the back of her neck, their hands brushing against her as she raced through the forest, desperate to escape. The lights flickered wildly around her, and she could hear the rumbling voice growing louder, demanding the toll. Just as she thought she could run no further, the clearing came into view, a faint glow breaking through the trees. With one final burst of energy, Grace stumbled into the clearing, collapsing onto the soft earth as the lights faded behind her. She lay there, gasping for breath, her heart racing as silence returned to the forest. She looked back, expecting to see the village, but there was nothing. Only the empty clearing, the stones, and the chilling memory of what she had seen. Grace left Willowbrook the next morning, her mind heavy with the knowledge of what lay hidden in the forest. She knew that the villagers of Birchwood were still there, trapped in a never-ending harvest feast, bound by a pact they could never break. And though she vowed never to return, she could never forget the haunting glow of those strange lights and the empty eyes of the villagers, forever waiting for the next soul to wander into their cursed festival. Thornville was a quiet town with cobbled streets and a modest station, long abandoned and forgotten by time. The station, with its ivy-covered walls and rusted tracks, had once been the lifeblood of Thornville, a bustling hub where trains arrived like clockwork. But after a tragic accident over a century ago, the station was shut down, and the tracks slowly decayed, hidden beneath a tangle of weeds and memories. The tale of that fateful night had faded into legend, but the townspeople still whispered about the ghost train of Thornville Station. It was said that at midnight, if you stood near the tracks, you could hear the faint sounds of a train rolling in, a distant whistle, the churning of wheels against the rails, and the hiss of steam. Locals avoided the area after dark, believing the train to be cursed, for anyone who had claimed to see the ghostly locomotive had met a mysterious, tragic fate within a week. Their lives ended in accidents, freak mishaps, or strange disappearances, as if the train itself reached out from beyond, claiming those who dared to witness its return. But to Liam Gardner, a skeptical journalist with a taste for ghost stories, the legend was a puzzle begging to be solved. Determined to uncover the truth, he set out on a brisk November night, camera and recorder in hand, ready to face whatever secrets Thornville Station held. The moon hung low and full in the sky as he made his way through the overgrown path to the station. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the cold breeze. Thornville Station appeared before him, its crumbling structure cast in eerie shadows, as if caught in a ghostly freeze frame of its former self. Liam set up his camera near the edge of the platform, glancing at his watch. It was 5 minutes until midnight. He felt a strange tension in the air, a pressure that seemed to build with each passing second. As the clock struck 12, a chill ran down his spine. He strained his ears, waiting, the only sound his own breathing. But then, faintly at first, he heard it, the distant, haunting whistle of a train. It was unmistakable, a lonely sound that seemed to drift from somewhere far away, echoing across the empty station. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble, a rhythmic vibration, as if a train were approaching. Liam held his breath as he peered down the tracks, and then he saw it. A faint glow appeared in the distance, growing brighter as it approached. The train was like nothing he'd ever seen. Its exterior was shimmering, transparent, as if made of smoke and light, the outline flickering in and out of existence. It was an old steam engine, its design belonging to another era entirely. The windows were dark, save for a dim, unnatural glow that seemed to shift and move as the train drew closer. Transfixed, Liam took a step back, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He raised his camera, capturing the train as it rolled to a stop in front of him, the hiss of steam filling the air. His eyes widened as he saw faces pressed against the windows, passengers staring out at him with hollow, vacant eyes, their expressions frozen in silent terror. They looked like shadows, their forms wavering as if trapped between worlds, bound to the train in an endless journey. The door to one of the carriages creaked open, and for a moment, Liam felt a powerful urge to step inside, a pull that was both thrilling and terrifying. He fought against it, his pulse racing as he looked into the carriage. The interior was dimly lit, shadows pooling in every corner, and the faint scent of burnt wood and decay lingered in the air. He could hear voices now, soft whispers, like fragments of conversations lost to time. Each word was tinged with sorrow, an echo of lives interrupted. Liam forced himself to look away, his heart pounding. He knew the stories, the warnings, but he had come too far to turn back. He stepped closer, his camera recording every moment. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice wavering, swallowed by the hiss of steam and the low murmur of the passengers. There was no response, only silence, and the unsettling sensation that he was being watched. The faces in the windows seemed to shift, turning their empty eyes on him, watching him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. And then he saw her, a woman dressed in a dark, old-fashioned gown, her hair pinned back, her face pale as moonlight. She stood near the edge of the platform, looking straight at him with eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to seep into his bones. Her lips moved, mouthing words he couldn't hear, but her gaze held him captive, rooted to the spot. Slowly, she raised her hand, as if beckoning him to come closer. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with fragments of stories, memories that weren't his own. He saw flashes, an accident on the tracks, the train derailing, the passengers trapped inside as flames consumed the carriages. Their faces twisted in terror, their hands pounding against the windows, their screams swallowed by the darkness. The images were so vivid, so real, that he felt as if he were there, a witness to the tragedy that had condemned these souls to an eternity of wandering. Just as he felt himself slipping, a cold wind blew through the station, snapping him back to the present. The train began to pull away, the figures inside turning back to face the dark beyond, their expressions slipping into blankness once more. The woman on the platform gave him one last mournful look before fading into the shadows as the train disappeared down the tracks, the whistle echoing in the night. Liam stood there, shaken, his mind reeling with what he had seen. He checked his camera, relieved to see the red light still blinking. He had recorded everything, proof of the ghost train. But as he watched the footage, a strange sense of dread crept over him. He had seen the train just as others before him, and he knew what that meant. The stories were clear. Anyone who witnessed the ghost train was marked. In the days that followed, Liam couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He heard strange sounds in his apartment, a faint, rhythmic chugging in the dead of night, the hiss of steam coming from nowhere. Shadows flitted at the edges of his vision, figures he recognized from the train, their eyes empty, their faces twisted in silent terror. He became jumpy, paranoid, feeling as though something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for him. A week after that fateful night, Liam was found dead in his apartment, a look of pure horror frozen on his face. The footage he had captured was gone, the memory card missing from his camera. The locals whispered about his fate, about how the ghost train had claimed another soul, and though his story spread, no one dared approach Thornville Station after dark, for they knew that the train still rolled through the night, bound to its tragic journey, waiting for the next curious soul to witness its passage and join the endless procession of the lost. In the town of Harrows Hollow, there was an old cemetery perched on the edge of a dense forest, its cracked tombstones and towering mausoleums blanketed by moss and ivy. The townsfolk avoided it after sundown, for it was known that strange things happened there at night. Those who had passed by after dark claimed to hear faint, haunting music drifting through the trees, a soft, mournful melody carried by the wind. The tune was rumored to be the last song of an old violinist who had died under mysterious circumstances and was buried in the cemetery many years ago. Local legend held that the song was a warning, meant to keep people away from the shadows that lurked within the cemetery. And those who didn't heed the warning, who followed the music, were never seen again. This legend intrigued Claire Sutton, a historian with a fascination for folklore. She had come to Harrows Hollow to study its history and had heard about the song from the locals, who spoke of it in fearful, hushed tones. She was a rational woman, driven by facts, not superstitions. And the idea of a haunted cemetery song seemed like nothing more than a story to keep children away from danger. Determined to prove the myth wrong, Claire decided to investigate the cemetery herself. It was a chilly autumn night, and the moon hung high and full as she made her way toward the cemetery gates, her flashlight casting long shadows along the narrow winding path. As she reached the wrought iron gates, she paused, the cemetery looming before her in eerie silence. The tombstones were like rows of silent sentries, their inscriptions faded by time, and the trees seemed to stretch out their skeletal branches as if to keep her out. Claire took a deep breath and stepped inside, her footsteps echoing faintly in the stillness. She glanced at her watch, just past midnight. She switched off her flashlight, letting the moonlight guide her path, hoping to heighten her senses and maybe catch a hint of the song the townsfolk feared so much. And then, just as she began to doubt the stories, she heard it, a soft, haunting melody drifting through the air. The music was faint, as if carried from a great distance, but unmistakable in its mournful beauty. The notes seemed to float through the cemetery, weaving around the tombstones and winding through the trees. Claire's heart quickened as she strained to listen, the tune both sad and strangely inviting. It was the sound of a lone violin, each note dripping with sorrow, painting a picture of lost love, of regret, of things left unsaid. Drawn by the music, Claire began to walk deeper into the cemetery, following the melody as it grew clearer with each step. The air was heavy, and a strange mist had begun to settle over the ground, swirling around her ankles as she moved. The tune seemed to pull her, leading her down twisting paths, past graves that hadn't seen a visitor in decades. She felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as though she were walking in circles, but the music never wavered, calling her closer, guiding her deeper into the heart of the cemetery. After a while, she found herself standing before a large, ancient mausoleum. Its stone was cracked and worn, its iron door covered in rust, but above the doorway was an inscription: Aldous Hawk, violinist, lost but not forgotten. Claire's pulse quickened as she realized this must be the source of the song. She had read of Aldous Hawk, a renowned musician in his day, known for his hauntingly beautiful compositions. But he had vanished under strange circumstances, his body found months later, his violin clutched in his bony fingers as if he had died mid-song. The music was louder now, drifting from somewhere within the mausoleum, each note filling her with an inexplicable sadness. She reached out, touching the cold iron handle, and with a creak, the door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The music seemed to beckon her down, echoing through the stone walls, wrapping around her like a soft, invisible hand. She hesitated, a shiver crawling up her spine, but curiosity drove her forward, her footsteps echoing down the steps as she descended into the blackness. At the bottom of the staircase, the air was thick and damp, carrying the scent of earth and decay. The passage opened into a small chamber, lit by faint, ghostly light. In the center of the room stood a figure, shrouded in shadows, a violin held delicately under his chin. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his posture graceful yet unnatural, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. But it was his hands that caught her attention, skeletal and pale, fingers moving deftly over the strings as if possessed by an otherworldly grace. The figure played on, unaware of her presence, or perhaps indifferent. The music was hypnotic, pulling her deeper into its spell, and Claire found herself transfixed, unable to look away. The notes wove a story of sorrow, of a life cut short, of dreams left unfulfilled. She felt as though the music were seeping into her soul, filling her with an aching sadness that was not her own. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging her, and she felt an icy chill race down her spine. She wanted to speak, to ask who he was, why he was here, but the words died in her throat. Suddenly, the music changed. The tune became sharper, more urgent, as if warning her, pleading with her to leave. She felt a weight press down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, and for the first time, a wave of fear washed over her. The figure's head snapped up, revealing hollow, empty eye sockets that seemed to stare right through her. His mouth stretched into a twisted smile as he continued to play, each note laced with malice, echoing through the chamber with a dark, foreboding energy. Claire stumbled backward, her heart pounding as she realized she was trapped. The shadows in the chamber seemed to grow thicker, creeping toward her, and the air grew colder, pressing in from all sides. She turned and bolted up the staircase, the music following her, echoing in her mind like a curse she couldn't escape. She burst out of the mausoleum, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but the music continued, lingering in the air, filling the cemetery with its haunting melody. She raced through the graves, her vision blurred, her body numb with fear. But no matter how far she ran, the music pursued her, each note etching itself into her memory. By the time she reached the gates, her body was trembling, her hands numb and cold. She didn't stop running until she was back in town, safe within the bright lights and the bustling sounds of the living. But the music never left her. In the days that followed, Claire could still hear it, soft, haunting, as if drifting through the walls of her mind. She became withdrawn, haunted by the memory of the figure in the mausoleum, his empty eyes and twisted smile, his music echoing through her every waking thought. Her friends grew concerned, watching as she faded, her once bright spirit dulled by something they couldn't understand. A week later, Claire's body was found near the cemetery gates, her face pale, her eyes wide and empty, as if she had seen something unspeakable in her final moments. In her hand was a single sheet of music, the notes scrawled in an ancient script, the title reading, Asterisk, the last song of Aldous Hawk. The townsfolk mourned her, and the legend of the cemetery song grew, passed down as a warning to those who might be tempted to follow the music after dark. And still, on moonlit nights, the mournful song drifts from the cemetery, a melody that lures the curious and the foolish, a song that promises sorrow and whispers of the souls forever bound to the shadows of the graves. Those who follow it are never seen again, claimed by the cemetery's last song, forever lost in its haunting refrain. Brierwood Inn sat nestled on the outskirts of a sleepy town, surrounded by thick woods and misty hills. Built in the early 1800s, the inn was once a grand estate, its rooms filled with wealthy travelers and lavish parties. But over the years, its splendor faded, and the inn took on a reputation as a place touched by strange happenings. Guests would speak of strange creaks in the walls, cold drafts where there should be none, and the feeling of being watched. But the most unsettling part of the inn was the mirror, a large antique piece framed in tarnished silver hanging in the hallway on the second floor. Its glass was pristine, almost unnaturally clear, as though untouched by the years. The townsfolk knew it as the mirror at Brierwood Inn, and they warned guests to avoid it, for it had the unnerving habit of revealing more than just reflections. The innkeeper, Mr. Farnsworth, had taken to warning guests of the mirror's peculiar nature, though he did so with a dry chuckle as though it were all just a harmless joke. "It's an old glass," he'd say, his voice low and gravelly. "Shows more than you might want to see." Most guests would laugh it off, but those who stayed long enough always ended up glancing nervously at the mirror, curiosity outweighing caution. And sometimes after midnight, if a guest dared to linger in front of it, they would see figures, shadowy shapes moving just behind them, faces half hidden in the darkness, their eyes glinting with secrets and intentions unknown. Emily West was one of those guests. She had come to Brierwood Inn to escape the city and finish her latest novel in peace, drawn to the inn by its history and the mystery that seemed to hang in the air. She'd been told about the mirror, but shrugged it off as mere superstition, a story to add a touch of drama to the old place. But late one stormy night, as she paced the hallway, struggling to find inspiration for her story, she found herself standing in front of the mirror. She couldn't resist. She paused, gazing into its depths, her own reflection staring back, tired and a little frazzled from hours of writing. At first, everything seemed normal, just her reflection, the dimly lit hallway behind her, the soft flicker of candlelight casting warm shadows. But then, in the corner of her eye, she noticed something, a figure, dark and indistinct, lurking just behind her shoulder. Emily froze, her heart hammering as she turned. But the hallway was empty. She laughed nervously, chalking it up to her tired eyes and active imagination. But when she looked back into the mirror, the figure was still there, closer this time, almost within reach. It was a tall, dark shape with no discernible features, only the vague outline of a face where eyes should be. She took a step back, her breath quickening, feeling a chill seep into her bones. She wanted to look away, but something held her gaze, an invisible force compelling her to keep watching. And then, as she stared, she saw her own reflection begin to change. Her face twisted, her eyes growing hollow and empty, her mouth stretching into a silent scream, as though reflecting a part of her that had been hidden deep within. The figure behind her seemed to lean closer, its hand reaching toward her shoulder, fingers elongated and shadowy. She stumbled back, finally breaking free from the mirror's spell, her pulse racing. The hallway was empty, quiet except for the faint creak of floorboards settling. She hurried back to her room, locking the door behind her, but she couldn't shake the image of her own hollow-eyed reflection, or the figure lurking just behind her. That night she barely slept, haunted by the memory of what she had seen. The mirror had shown her something dark and unsettling, something that felt like a warning. The next morning, she spoke to Mr. Farnsworth about the mirror, hoping he might have a logical explanation, a trick of the light, or an old story to calm her nerves. He listened with a solemn expression, nodding slowly as she described what she had seen. "You're not the first to see it," he said, his voice heavy. "The mirror, it shows things we keep hidden, regrets, fears, maybe even things to come. Some say it reveals our darkest secrets. Others believe it's a glimpse of a doomed future." Emily felt a chill run down her spine, but she brushed it off, determined not to let fear get the best of her. She returned to her room, forcing herself to write, to focus on anything but the mirror. But as the days passed, strange things began to happen. She would catch fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures in the corners of her room, hear faint whispers echoing through the walls, words she couldn't quite make out. At night, she would wake to the feeling of cold fingers brushing her shoulder, only to find herself alone in the dark. Her dreams grew increasingly disturbing. She saw herself wandering the inn's halls, her face pale and hollow, her eyes blank and lifeless. The shadowy figure followed her, a constant presence, always lurking just behind, its hand reaching out as if to claim her. She would wake drenched in sweat, her heart racing, the memory of the dream lingering like a dark cloud. She couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror had shown her a vision, a warning of something terrible waiting for her. One night, unable to stand it any longer, she returned to the mirror. It was close to midnight, the inn silent, the air thick with tension. She stood in front of the glass, her reflection staring back at her, her face pale and drawn. She waited, holding her breath, half expecting to see the shadow again. And then, as if summoned, it appeared, slowly emerging from the darkness, standing just behind her. But this time, there was something different. The figure's face became clearer, its features sharpening, and Emily realized with a shock that it was her own face, twisted and grotesque, as though corrupted by fear and despair. The reflection reached out, its hand mirroring her own, pressing against the glass, its hollow eyes staring into hers. She felt a wave of terror wash over her as she realized the reflection wasn't just mimicking her. It was moving independently, watching her with a sinister smile. Her breath hitched as the figure whispered, its voice barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. "You cannot escape. We are one." The words filled her mind, echoing over and over, drowning out her thoughts. She stumbled back, tearing her gaze from the mirror, but the reflection remained, staring back at her with that twisted, malevolent smile. Emily fled, her mind spinning, the shadows seeming to close in around her. She left the inn that night, not daring to look back, but the image of her own corrupted reflection haunted her every waking moment. The shadows seemed to follow her, lingering at the edges of her vision, a constant reminder of what she had seen. A week later, the staff found an old journal left in her room, its pages filled with desperate, frantic writing. She had written of the mirror, of the shadows, of the warning it had given her. The last page simply read, "The mirror shows us what we truly are, what we will become." From that day on, guests continued to see the mirror, and every so often a curious soul would stop to look, ignoring the whispers to stay away. And when they did, they would see the shadows, waiting, watching, revealing glimpses of their darkest secrets, or perhaps a glimpse into a future that could not be changed. Brierwood Inn continued to stand, the mirror hanging silently on the wall, its glass polished and clear, waiting for the next person to reveal the secrets hidden within. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.